Welcome y'all. In this tutorial, we are going to show you how to configure API requests. This is going to be a lot of fun and it's going to unlock a lot of value for your n8n automations. Now, we've seen API requests in the past, particularly in our lessons with AI agents. So now's our chance to put on the brakes for just a second and go back and figure out what is an API call and what does it let us do? Well, it's kind of like texting. You send a text to your friend. He might be 3 continents away, but he could still get it in minutes and you would get a reply back also really, really fast. And that's sort of what an API call is. It's texting for machines, and it's called API because it stands for Application Programming Interface. Now, I don't want to get too technical in this tutorial. I kind of want to stay on the surface level as we have in the tutorials recently. So hopefully we're going to get a lot out of this. Now let's look at configuration. Okay, which webhook URL do they want? Oh, here we go. Lesson 1, the basics URL. Okay, I actually really like that we're working with custom API calls because there are public services that you can call with API calls. A prominent example is Overpass. Say you're doing a lead gen workflow, you can make an API request to something like Overpass to get B2B leads. That's really, really valuable. But in this example, we are using API requests to activate another workflow within the same workspace. And that's really, really cool. In fact, in the node library, you will find sub workflow. Look at this. There's an action, execute a sub workflow, and there is also a trigger when executed by another workflow. Typically, I prefer the API call version of this. Do use an API call and a custom webhook to execute a sub workflow in the same workspace, just because that way we can keep all of the workflows in the same workspace. With the execute a sub workflow node, those ones will only let you do one in the same workspace. And that is simply because they work based on your workflow ID, which is this little bit of your URL in there. Let's go ahead and drop one in just so you can see what I mean. Now, if we wanted to put in a sub workflow for it to execute, because it works based on this workflow ID here, let's copy that from list by ID, and there we have it. Now, if we only had one sub workflow in workspace, then this would work to activate this sub workflow and go ahead and execute it. The reason I prefer API calls and custom webhooks to this is you can have more than one in the same workflow. And you'll see in this lesson we have like 4 or 5. So really, really cool. Still a valuable node. I prefer to have all my sub workflows in the same workspace. It's just how I prefer to organize. Simplest possible request. Okay, so we are gonna get this URL because that is the URL that listens for our API call. Now, the HTTP method basically tells us how the data is transferring between in this request. Commonly, a post request is how you send data to that external service, and a get request is when you receive data from that external service, the thing you're activating. So get or post are going to be your main 2 requests that you make. In fact, I haven't configured the other 4. I don't know what a delete, past, head, or put. I've never put together a delete request or a head or a patch or a put. So get or post are the main ones you're going to be using. Now let's go to the API request one, paste that in, and it's already in the get request form. So, okay, good. Let's go ahead and run this from start tutorial. Now we should be able to see, why did it go wrong? Book test tutorial. API main. Oh, I see why it didn't work. So we need to say, see, this is pulling the JSON.base URL from this node, the base URL. What the heck? Huh. Oh, I see. So we haven't pasted your webhook URL here. So, or we should actually paste this URL isn't in the API request because see, they have it configured to map it from all of these other calculations they do with the edit fields nodes. Let's hit save and execute from start tutorial. Let's see if this works. Huh, it mapped correctly. So we got Blackfish AI and cloud/webhook/tutorial/API/menu. Does it expect query parameters? What if we switch it to active? So that way all our webhooks are listening by default, and then we hit execute workflow. Look at that. Our API request outputs the data that it gets from running this workflow. The reason we're not seeing it is because n8n considers these separate workflows. And so if we wanted to review the data that got passed in a sub workflow, we'll need to look at one of these. See, this execution tracks the data that got passed in this sub workflow. This is the execution logs, by the way. This is how you're going to see what happened in which specific one. Usually the bottom one out of all the different executions that were created, that's the main one, the one that's activating the API calls. And then the rest is what's going to happen in these sub workflows. So let's go ahead and double click the prepare menu data node and we'll see what's going on. Oh, it just gave us, a $12 pizza. Now let's see. Customizing a request. Yeah, this is query parameters. When you want to, look at that. So query parameters are valuable for a couple of things. One of the main ones is if you want to specify what data you're trying to extract in the API request. In this example, we are only interested in menu options that have extra cheese. So what's going to happen in here? I like the GIF that they put around the if node. So this is okay, good. By the way, paths and endpoints are very important to consider when you are setting up your API request. It's kind of like knowing which phone number you're sending a text to. The path or endpoint is usually the bit at the end of the URL that you are sending the API request to, and that specifies which database you're trying to hit. Now let's check this out. Okay, so this if extra cheese option, we're looking at the query parameters sent by the API request, and we want to know whether it's true. In that case, we want to prepare cheese pizza with extra cheese. Awesome. Or maybe we want to get a plain pizza. So let's see this in action. Let's run the tutorial again. Okay, yeah, see, we sent the extra cheese as part of our request. So what if we wanted to instead get a regular pizza? So let's switch this query parameter to false, save, and start tutorial, and there we have it. Now we have a plain pizza. Make sense, guys? Perfect. Here we go. Now we're configuring a post request. Okay, so let's pop this open and see what we're looking at. Yeah, so look at that. We're posting the review to, let's say to a website. We would want to hit that API URL with a post request and say, hey, let me give you body parameters. Those are different than query parameters, which is an important distinction to make. The main thing is the body parameters are when you are not specifying the data you want to get, and you are instead sending data that you want to post. For example, in fact, this was the first API request I ever really configured. It was for a LinkedIn bot. So I basically built an AI agent that would help me write a LinkedIn post. And once it had something I was happy with, I could ask it to go ahead, and it went ahead and did it because it knew, oh, this is the data that I should put in the body parameters, and this is the API URL. that I should hit. And that was the first API request I've ever set up. So we want to use this webhook to post review. Look at that. We are pulling the comment and rating from the body parameters that are sent to this webhook. Custom webhooks, guys, some cool stuff can happen. Ooh, identification, headers and auth. Now, in my experience, the headers don't specifically, look at this. You can have your authentication inside of your headers, but more often it simply specifies what type of data it is, which helps your webhook to understand what data it is receiving. So for example, you can expect to find headers like content type and the value application/JSON. That's a pretty common one. You can also send your API key inside the headers rather than as its own authentication. But authentication is typically when you're, look at this, you get two different types of credentials you can set up, generic or predefined, and we're just gonna go ahead with basic. This is important when you are hitting a public API or something of that nature. For example, maybe you are pinging a weather service online and you are asking it to give you the weather news. It will usually give you an API key, and that is a string of letters and numbers that say this is who I am. Now, right now, we are going to go back to none because you can see a X API key is already in our headers, so we don't have to worry about configuring the authentication. Again, every API is kind of different. Some will expect it in headers. This is why I often build these things with ChatGPT at my side, because it will be able to know these finer details for me. Okay, this is important. We want to make sure that the API service that we call is not going to be busy, and if it is, we need to decide what we're going to do about it. So in this example, it waits 2000 milliseconds. See, time in milliseconds to wait for the server to send response headers. We can set it to wait for longer. In fact, I'm going to set this to 5,000. That's 5 seconds for everybody who doesn't believe in the metric system. Now let's see. Here's our URL. Good. Timeout exceeded. Okay. Now, whoops. See, look at this. It gives us a wait node of 3 seconds before we prepare our response. Finally, your food is here. Now, we are going to execute workflow from start tutorial one more time just to see. Yep, see, this time it went down the success branch, which is awesome. Always good to see. Finally, your food is here. Food that takes 3 seconds to cook. What the crap? And then they gave us this nice chip. Holy cow, he is working. That man is working. All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. Hopefully it was something you learned from and got value from, because API requests are a big part of how you are going to be able to handle more valuable data transfer in your automations. So with that being said, be sure to leave a like, share your thoughts with the class, and before you subscribe, make sure you know what you're doing, because it ain't easy being at the top. I'll see you guys next time.
Cutting through the blazing rain. Thunder rolling, but I ride the wave again. Deep tide rising, hear the echo call. Born of the fury, I was made to